Good evening, everyone, and welcome to 5 by 15. We've got a brilliant lineup for you this evening, so get comfortable and enjoy the fantastic talks that you're about to hear. Remember that you can buy copies of all of our speakers' books from our independent bookselling partner, Newen Bookshop, and details about how to do that will be posted in the chat shortly. Without any further ado, let me introduce our first speaker tonight. It's Earth Day today, a day dedicated to the celebration of protecting our planet. So we're especially glad to have with us Philip Lymbery, who is no stranger to 5 by 15. Philip is an award-winning author, animal advocate, and chief executive of the leading international farm animal welfare organization, Compassion in World Farming. He's written numerous acclaimed books, and he's here tonight to talk about his exciting new work on cultivated meat. Philip, welcome.
Jack, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be back with you. And let me see, navigate the technology and share my screen. And then I'm going to tell you about cultivated meat, how we can use it to secure our future. So essentially, what's this all about? Well, let's look to the sky for a moment, and let me take you back to September 2019 and 250 miles above the Earth, hurtling at 15,000 miles an hour. The International Space Station was about to do something extraordinary. It was about to produce the first beefsteak in space. Only there was no cow. What there was crew members aboard the space station. One of them in a white T-shirt, looking remarkably underdressed for doing something so incredible, as he poured stem cells that had been blasted on a rocket ship into a nutrient soup to produce the first 3D steak from cultivated meat. This product, cultivated meat, is what it sounds like. It is producing meat, but without the animal. Often called lab meat by the media, it's something which it could be a real game changer for the future of food. Let me tell you why I see this as important. Well, when I'm at home, I live on a farm in West Sussex. My neighbours are 40 cows, and this is a picture of those 40 cows. And it looks a bucolic scene, and it is. I'm currently in Brussels, though, talking to the European Commission about the future of EU agriculture. And I can tell you that in the UK, in the EU, and increasingly across the planet, the animals are not quite kept as I know them at home. The majority of animals are caged, crammed, and confined, kept in factory farms, be that for meat, milk, or eggs. And factory farming essentially has two sides of it. There's the sides where the first side is where the animals are, which looks like a space-saving idea, but actually isn't, because we have to having taken the animals off of pasture and out of woodland edges and off the land, we have to use vast acreages of relatively scarce arable land elsewhere to grow the animals' feed. More than half of the arable land in the UK is dedicated to animal feed, nearly 2/3 in the EU. And of course, 35 million tons of soya is also imported into Europe every year as animal feed. This has a massive impact because keeping animals in factory farms means that essentially we grow their feed in an industrial way using chemical pesticides and fertilizers, and fields start to get bigger, and those fields start to turn into prairie-like scenarios. And as the fields get bigger, so the trees, the bushes, and the hedges disappear. Then the chemicals come in, the pesticides, the artificial fertilizers, which means that the weeds and the insects that are needed by the birds, the bees, the butterflies, and everything else disappear, leaving us with the crop. And then what do we do with that crop? We feed it to the factory farmed animals, who then waste the vast majority of the calories and protein involved in conversion to meat, milk, and eggs. In this way, we waste enough food to feed half of humanity alive today, 4 billion people. It's a waste. It's a meaty impact. And I show you this slide of an American feedlot where you can get 100,000 cattle, not a blade of grass in sight, totally different from the West Sussex farm hamlet where I live. And those animals will be grass, will be fed on grain. And so what is that meaty impact? Well, animal agriculture produces 14.5% of total greenhouse gases. That's more than all the exhaust fumes from the world's planes, trains, and cars put together. Agriculture occupies half the world's habitable land. 83% of it is dedicated to animal production, providing humanity with just 37% of our protein, less than a fifth of our calories. Essentially, we're being shortchanged. We're using all that land, creating all of those greenhouse gases. And for what? 37% of our protein comes from livestock production, which shows you that plants are producing the majority of our protein directly for human consumption. It's a big impact. And the trouble that we've got is that factory farming is not only the biggest cause of animal cruelty on the planet, but is integral to the climate challenge that we're all facing, the triple planetary challenge, as the UN calls it, of climate, the collapse of nature, and the increase in pollution. But what factory farming also does is it has a big impact on the one thing we need for food in the future. It erodes, it has a big impact on our soils. Soils are eroding 100 times faster than they're being formed. A third of soils worldwide are already degraded. And scientific assessment is that if we carry on as we are, then we have just 60 harvests left till the soil is gone. 60 years left. No soil, no food. Game over. So we need a rethink. If we're going to bring back nature, if we're going to stave off catastrophic climate change, if we're going to save the means to create food in the future, then perhaps we've got to rethink what we're doing and what we're putting on our plate. Rethinking protein is a really important theme going forward. And one of the reasons for that is that the global appetite for meat is currently busting planetary boundaries, be they climate or biodiversity or nitrogen and other aspects. In 2015, we were busting 3 planetary boundaries out of possible 9. Now we're busting 6, and things are getting worse. So how do we rethink protein? Well, the first thing is, if we're going to get food back within our planetary boundaries, then we're going to need to reduce the amount of meat and dairy that we're eating. It's not something everyone wants to hear, but that is the scientific assessment. How much reduce? Well, about 50% globally. And in high consuming regions like the UK, the EU, and America, we need to reduce by more than 50%, 70% in the UK and Europe, 80% in the USA. So these are big challenges. And we've seen the rise in plant-based meats. We've seen the rise in veganism, which is wonderful. I remember 35 years ago that veganism was something which most people didn't understand. They hadn't heard of it. If you said you were a vegan, they said, what? They thought you were talking about something from Star Trek. I remember the media talking about the vegan society as being the flat earth society of food. But now things are different, and plant-based meats are meat alternatives are now coming much more to the fore. Pat Brown, CEO of Impossible Foods, one of the leading innovators, says that, and unlike the cow, we're getting better at making meat every single day. So this could be part of our solution in reducing the amount of meat and dairy we are eating. But the trouble is that despite the rise in recognition of the need to reduce meat consumption, despite the rise in plant-based alternatives, more people are eating more meat across the world than ever before. We have an insatiable appetite for meat, and this is an issue that we have to address. So let's call in a new innovation: meat, but without the downsides. Cultivated meat, meat that is produced from stem cells in a bioreactor. Those stem cells are taken from living animals using a harmless biopsy, and then grown in the bioreactor. The great news is that it's much lighter on the planet in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, 80 to 95% lower, particularly when you're using renewable energy, 98% less land needed. And in a world where we're running out of land and diminishing our soils, that's important. And the great thing is that a single sample from a cow can produce a huge amount of cultivated meat, 80,000 quarter pounders. Now, this is not just a pipe dream. It's not science fiction. This is something which is now starting to see commercial reality. It's already been given the go-ahead for commercial sale. Cultivated chicken in Singapore and the United States Department of Agriculture gave approval to 2 companies in 2023. And there are predictions that cultivated meat could be widely available in shops near you within the next 5 to 10 years, which is so important. When we're looking to put our food system back within planetary boundaries, end the animal cruelty, stop the destruction of our soil and the emission of greenhouse gases, what better than to use the renewable energy equivalent of food? Renewable energy is something which is produced differently without the fossil fuels, of course, but still you access it in the same way. You put your plug into the socket and your device powers up just as it did before. Well, the great thing about cultivated meat is it's meat without the downsides. It's meat, but not as we know it. It is the renewable energy equivalent of food. So when we go back to that space mission in 2019, it was interesting to note that the company behind that mission, a company called Aleph Farms, wanted to show that cultivated meat really could be produced anywhere, anytime. That was the point. And when we look back at the urgency with which we need to change our food system if we're going to avoid planetary catastrophe, then what better than to look to that space mission for inspiration? And I believe that we now have a once in a history opportunity to create a sustainable future for our children. That is what's at stake. And that we, with time running out, we could be looking back on that space mission, trialing cultivated meat, and see it as one small step for humanity and one giant leap for life on Earth. Thank you so much for listening. Cultivated meat to secure our future. Jack, back to you. Thank you so much.
Philip, thank you so much. That was so eye-opening and hopeful, and a call to arms, and really fantastic to hear your insights into this future, this glimpse into the future. Thank you. Our second speaker this evening is the academic, writer, and historian Agnes Arnold-Forster. She's a Chancellor's Fellow at Edinburgh and has worked at McGill University, Queen Mary, and the Max Planck Center for Human Development in Berlin. In her fascinating new book, Nostalgia, A History of a Dangerous Emotion, Agnes blends neuroscience and psychology with the history of medicine and emotions to tell the story of nostalgia and its evolution. We're really excited to hear more about it. Agnes, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, and good evening, everyone. So I was a very nostalgic child, blending fairy tales with horrible histories. I'd spend hours luxuriating in an imagined and rose-tinted view of a past I'd never experienced. I was a huge Enid Blyton fan, and I spent so much of my time wishing and demanding almost my parents would send me away from my 1990s like local primary to a boarding school in 1950s Cornwall so I could live out those fantasies. They refused, and so instead I spent every day going to my otherwise uniform-free state school in a little button-down shirt and pleated skirt. As I grew older, I cut some of these emotional ties to the past and developed a much more cynical relationship with history. I did a history degree and then another, turning into a much more steely academic that tried to avoid the kind of sentimentality I'd indulged in the past. And the reason for this is that academic historians have a pretty low opinion of nostalgia. They see it as the preserve, or rather they tend to see it as the preserve of amateurs, reenactors, hobbyists, popularizers. You know, they can be snobs sometimes. But really the point of being an academic historian, after all, is to turn a much more critical lens at the past, a critical lens at history, and see it for what it is, warts and all. Nostalgia and that kind of vision of the past don't really meld very well. And also, nostalgia is supposed to be at odds with some other aspects of my personality or identity, I suppose. I see myself as politically progressive and personally an optimist. But despite all this kind of shift away from nostalgia, I do sometimes still allow myself a bit of the feeling now and again as a little treat. And sometimes this feeling of indulging in nostalgia is a slight embarrassment, because even beyond the walls of the ivory tower, you know, it doesn't just have to be academics, but nostalgia has something of a poor reputation. It is seen as a small c conservative emotion, and sometimes a big C conservative emotion. The sociologist Yanis Gabriel called it the latest opiate of the people. And it's supposed to be something indulged in by antiquarians and sentimentalists, and it is still blamed for a range of perceived social and political sins. But for all of that bad rep, nostalgia used to be even worse. You don't have to travel that far back in time to find it listed as a cause of protracted illness or even death. Nostalgia was first coined as a term and used as a diagnosis in 1688 by a Swiss physician called Johannes Hofer. Derived from the Greek nostos, or homecoming, and algos, or pain, this mysterious disease was a kind of pathological homesickness, a yearning, place-based sickness. It caused lethargy, depression, and disturbed sleep, but it could also cause physical ailments like heart palpitations, open sores, and dementia. For many people, although not all, it could prove fatal. Sufferers would slowly starve themselves to death. It was particularly common, or supposed to be, amongst students, mercenary soldiers, and domestic servants, so anyone who was compelled to leave their home. It was first coined in 17th century Switzerland, and the Swiss were supposed to be uniquely vulnerable, partly because Switzerland was supposed to be so beautiful that anyone who left it would be so desperate to return. It continued, though, and spread far beyond the confines of not just Switzerland, but Europe. And during the American Civil War in the middle of the 19th century, it was the leading cause of non-combat death for soldiers. So even those who didn't fight and die in battle would succumb to this kind of pathological homesickness. And the last known victim of nostalgia was a foot soldier fighting on the Western Front in 1917. So that was his cause of death listed on his death certificate. In the 20th century, nostalgia loosened its grip on the medical mind, parted ways with homesickness, and morphed first into a psychological disorder and then into the relatively benign emotion, although still troubled one, we know and love today. Early psychoanalysts in the 1930s and 40s had a pretty low opinion of the feeling and very little patience for the nostalgics they encountered on their therapist couches. They thought nostalgics were neurotic or unable or unwilling to face reality. And frankly, these psychoanalysts were pretty snobbish. They thought that the middle classes were less likely to be nostalgic than lower class or tradition-bound people. They thought middle classes were forward-looking, cosmopolitan, not backward-looking or stultified. In the 1970s, these psychological and psychoanalytic views softened, and psychologists today have a very different vision of the emotion. They see it as a near universal and fundamentally positive feeling, a powerful psychological resource that provides people with a variety of benefits, both social, emotional, and psychological. They've done studies and they claim that it can boost self-esteem, increase people's feelings of meaning in life, foster a sense of social connectedness, encourage people to seek help and support for their problems, improve mental health, and attenuate things like loneliness, boredom, stress, or anxiety, something of a panacea. It can even be used and is used as an intervention designed to maintain and improve memory among older adults, particularly people with dementia. It can be used to enrich psychological health and ameliorate depression. But despite these efforts on behalf of psychologists to kind of, I suppose, rehabilitate nostalgia, the reputation of the emotion today, particularly as an influence on politics and society, is not so honeyed. It is blamed for the rise of several political populist movements and the kind of past that nostalgic are seen to evoke now is often criticized for being overly white, overly male. Things like imperial nostalgia, colonial nostalgia, these sorts of political touchstones are common and pervasive. Nostalgics are still often described as retrograde, conservative, and sentimental. They're blamed for the electoral success of people like Donald Trump, and lots of people blamed Brexit on nostalgia, on a kind of epidemic, I suppose, of the condition. And this is where I think there's something funny in the afterlife of nostalgia as a disease, as it was in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, because I think in some ways it remains a kind of diagnosis, not so much a prompt to further investigate, but rather as a kind of almost dismissive explanation for what a critic might see as wayward or even irrational acts, like voting for Brexit or Donald Trump. As the historian Robert Saunders put it, in reference to Brexit, the prevailing rhetoric marked out the Leave vote as, and I quote, a psychological disorder, a pathology to be diagnosed rather than an argument with which to engage. And this is strange, this sort of tendency to lump nostalgia in with the political right, with populism, because nostalgia is, of course, a feature of left-wing political life as well. Think of the NHS, a much-loved British institution and a bastion of left-wing political identity. I'm a historian, and by training, I'm a historian of medicine and healthcare, and my real kind of area of expertise is the history of the NHS. And there is a lot of nostalgia in and about the NHS. You can kind of see that best encapsulated in the pageantry around the Olympic Games opening ceremony in 2012, when women dressed up as 1950s nurses danced across the stage. And I think there's this real kind of attempt to capture an NHS of days gone by. But it also doesn't really work as an explanation for right-wing tendencies or populist political leanings, because if you take present-day psychology seriously, everyone is nostalgic pretty much all of the time, and it doesn't seem to track along political lines. And as I sort of mentioned, nostalgia is more than just benign. It can be actively therapeutic. So psychologists say that when people indulge in nostalgic reflections, the mind is peopled. The emotion can affirm symbolic ties with friends, lovers, family members. And in the moment of nostalgia, close others come to be momentarily part of one's present. It helps people feel more loved and protected, reduces anxiety. People who have Nostalgic tendencies are also more likely to have secure attachment styles, and are even supposed to have better social skills. And so perhaps, and this I think is really the undercurrent of my book, or rather the thing I wanted to explore when I started writing it, perhaps nostalgia needs a bit of rehabilitation, even in other non-psychological areas of life. Because as I've sort of talked about, nostalgia as a society as a whole, and especially academia, my kind of home, tends still to see emotions as irritants, as contaminants. And while there is, I think, more and more cultural pressure to talk about our feelings, acknowledge trauma and distress publicly, and seek help and support when unhappy, anxious, or depressed, at the same time, some emotional responses are still seen as more appropriate for adults than others. I write a bit about homesickness in the book as well, and I think that's something that really is infantilized. Political and professional decisions that are seen to be driven by feelings are still taken less seriously than those deemed motivated by reason, rationality, or research. And of course, as a historian, I'm very keen on research. But as a historian of emotions, I'm also keen on feelings. I'm interested in their variety, curious about their range, and I think I take very seriously their power. And nostalgia, I think, or maybe I'm suggesting, could do with something of a makeover. Can it be rescued from its associations with the sick, the stupid, and the sentimental? And the way I've kind of opted to think about and write about nostalgia is to see it not just as a kind of malign presence in modern society, but a source of both pain and pleasure, something that explains so much about modern life. It is one way that we communicate a desire for the past, like for me, a dissatisfaction about the present, and perhaps paradoxically even our vision for the future. And I suppose I wrote my book to think about whether nostalgia has the capacity to be progressive as well as conservative, not just stultifying, but maybe creative too. And instead of isolating, whether politically or personally, can we see it instead as a profoundly social emotion, one that can draw us together, not just push us apart? I hope you've enjoyed this and given a little taster, and you'll have to read the book, I suppose, to find out if I've been successful. Thank you.
Agnes, thank you so much. As a very nostalgic person, I found that fascinating and it feels very timely. And I'd really recommend you get a copy of Agnes's book, Nostalgia. It's absolutely fascinating. Thank you for being with us this evening. Our next speaker tonight is the novelist Andrew O'Hagan, one of the most exciting and serious chroniclers of our time. A 3-time nominee for the Booker Prize and voted one of Granta's best of young British novelists in 2003. His previous novel, Mayflies, won huge acclaim and was adapted into an award-winning television drama for the BBC. His highly anticipated new book, Caledonian Road, has become an instant Sunday Times bestseller, and we're delighted to have Andrew with us this evening to talk about it. Andrew, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me. After spending 10 years researching and writing Caledonian Road, this seems a nice opportunity to pause for 15 minutes and think about how it came about and what that relationship with some of those big Victorians was all about. So many of the people who have written about the book in the last 2 weeks have used the word Dickensian. And although that was often a word somewhere in my head, I don't know if I've ever sat down for 15 minutes and really worked through what that would mean. He's certainly one of my favourite writers, and he's been there kind of on my shoulder as a sort of whispering advisor through all the years that I was working on this book. I want to take you back a wee bit further first. When I was about 7 or maybe 8, in primary 3, as we call it in the UK, I had a teacher called Mrs. Docherty who encouraged us to write something called our news book. So our news books were, I suppose, to practice our handwriting, but I took the job slightly seriously. And every morning, I'd arrive in class and there'd be 30 kids in our rows, and I would start writing my news book. And very quickly, it became clear to Mrs. Docherty and to me that I was appointing myself as a slightly frontline reporter from the living room back home. So my coming and going father and my slightly upsettable mum would find themselves fully described in the news book of this 8-year-old. And the teacher called my mother in and said, I don't know what it is about Andrew, but he seems to sort of have taken the idea of news a bit literally, and he's become a bit of a reporter. So the situation in the hurly-burly at home is all being fully described in the news book. That was an early showing, I think, of an instinct that I have, and that many of us have who are interested in writing novels, to, if you like, marry up observed reality with the work of the imagination, to let creative writing, if you like, borrow or depend to some extent on visible experience. One of the people who gives us courage and permission when it comes to this pursuit is, of course, Charles Dickens. And he has been on my shoulder much longer than the time that it's taken to write Caledonian Road. He's actually been there for me as a kind of tutor and a friend almost to the open consciousness that I think is required if you're going to write about a lot of characters and a lot of people from different walks of life. I've depended quite a lot on Dickens's journalism over the course of my writing career, I think. And I made a note here of a bunch of pieces written between 1850 and 1860, where Dickens took on the task of going into the places that he intended to feature in his novels. He wasn't the sort of writer who, if he was describing an orphanage, would just kind of dream up an orphanage. There was lots of dream work in his writing, but he would go to an orphanage, he'd talk to the people who worked there, he'd examine the children, talk to them about their backstories. That's the kind of reporter and novelist he was. He invented a kind of reported fiction, in my view. This list here includes things like a walk in a workhouse from 1850, going out with detectives that same year, going to a paper mill later in the year, the next day covering the railway strikes of 1851, roaming around Spitalfields endlessly, picking up character, detail. Going on duty with Inspector Field was one of his pieces from 1851. Assistant Commissioner of Police, Field, his main responsibility was looking after the British Museum at night. So he'd go in with the equivalent of a torch, a lamplight, and would go through the rooms, looking at the Elgin marbles, going in among the Roman sculptures, into the Chinese department to make sure everything was safe and secure. But on this particular visit from Dickens, he also took him into St. Giles's Church, where there were huddles of unaccommodated men and women, that's to say, homeless people, in the basement of the church. And Dickens examined their lives, their clothes, their eating habits, their needs, and brought it all back to his fiction. I have to say that when I was writing Caledonian Road, I had this notion all the time of Our Mutual Friend, published in 1864. So just a few years after he stopped writing these big reported pieces, and he harvested all that detail in that tremendous novel. It's his last completed novel, Our Mutual Friend, and it's a magnificent, magical piece of human imagining. What you find in that novel is that the River Thames becomes not just a metaphorical thoroughfare that connects up all these different people in the novel, hordes of characters, but it's also more than metaphorical. It's like a kind of physical solution in which these people's dream life and their working life is bathed. I'll never forget coming across that novel for the first time. I was quite young and thinking, what would it be like if a modern novel had a thoroughfare like the River Thames, touching on people not only from different walks of life, but people who we seldom see described in novels, people from the high life of the aristocracy right down to street gangs. What about Russian oligarchs? What about people who turn up in the Old Bailey? What about the life of a newspaper? What about the life of a sweatshop where Bangladeshi women are passing garments back and forward? I discovered whilst researching Caledonian Road that some of the highest numbers of deaths from COVID in this country were among those Bangladeshi women who were working in unsafe conditions in unsafe factories in the Midlands. And I went there using the Dickens example, going into it as he went into workhouses and trying to interview everyone, try to get a sense of exactly what the conditions were and what the reality was for these people who were working there. Why Caledonian Road, though? I have to say that Dickens, again, was there, a kind of tutelary shadow in the background. I lived in King's Cross when I first came to London, aged 21. I came from Glasgow on the overnight bus, which used to park itself at King's Cross. And I came out to this bustling bit of London, which I later learned hadn't changed in its appearance really since the 1940s. Still cobbled streets behind the station in those days, the great gas holders, which have since moved up the canal and are now full of £7 million in some cases, penthouse flats. But in those days, it was cobbled streets, it was gasometers, it was the two Victorian railway stations of St Pancras and King's Cross, the Regent's Canal flowing through, and up the side of it, that great North London street, Caledonian Road. What I discovered about Caledonian Road from living there was that it was one of the most multifaceted streets in Britain. On the one side of the road, you had those huge wedding cakey houses in places like Thornhill Square, posh houses worth millions, getting more valuable all the time through the 1990s and through the noughties. This explosion of sort of property value that was happening, which I hadn't quite seen in a novel yet. And on the other side of Caledonian Road, there was social housing, and there were people, often migrant communities, coming into London, new languages, new voices, new cultures into the street all the time. When I looked at the Victorian poverty maps for Caledonian Road from the 1890s, not far distant from when our friend Charles Dickens was writing Our Mutual Friend 25 years later, what we find is a colour coding of the social and economic conditions of all the people living in the streets around King's Cross. And here's the news. When I laid that colour map over the map of King's Cross during the period that I've been writing about it, it's exactly the same. The same squares are still full of wealthy people, the same places that were used to be full of rented accommodation and workhouses, goods yards, and people living in dwelling rooms and so on in conditions of poverty. It's still the same. Right around Pentonville Prison and all those streets today, you can look at them and see that despite hundreds of years of change, of technological development, of the NHS, of living in a welfare state, still the inequalities are the same. And that seems to me a provocation for a novelist. It certainly did when I was working on Caledonian Road, that here was an opportunity to try and explain that and to show that, to dramatise it, to show 60 characters in constant motion, all of whom seem to be touched somehow by Caledonian Road, who they seem to pass up it, pass through it, see it every day, buy food there, go from that station. And we think they're all living lives apart, but slowly in the drama of the novel, there's an accumulating sense of them all coming together, that they really are under the same weather, breathing the same air. For all their differences, they are in the world at the same time. They are in London at the same time. They are London. And I wanted the novel to carry that. The reception to this novel has overwhelmed me because people are seeing the drama and seeing the connection as if they'd been waiting for somebody to describe contemporary London back to them. But I have to tell you that the main connection to Dickens is the endless sense of the research that had to be done. Months and months in the Old Bailey, going in search of oligarchs, ending up in nightclubs with these guys, running up huge bills, pouring expensive wine onto the carpet, hanging out at the polo trials at Windsor, going out with street gangs. There's a lot of costume changes involved for me whilst researching this book. And the thing that you come away with in the end is a sense that reality and imagination have a lot to do with each other in the end, as we've always suspected. Great films depend on it. Great television serials depend on it. And for this long time since, the big social novel depends on it, that the connections are real, that this, a comedy of manners, and it is a comedy in the end, because the scenes, one after the other, try to reveal the essential comic nature. at the heart of not only communities and families, but individuals. People are funny, even in adversity. That was one of the things that kept me going, certainly. But as well as that, there's a relationship between comedy and morality. And if we can get the novel to be alive to that, alive to the notion that we don't live single lives, discreetly, separately, unrelatedly to each other. We might have our secret histories, our hinterlands, our exclusive truths we feel that are only true about us, individually or as groups. But in the end, we are breathing the same air. And the novel is a great communality. That's what I wanted for this book. And that's what I got from my friend Charles Dickens. Thanks for listening.
Andrew, thank you so much. That was so illuminating and such a resonant way of thinking about a London that we all recognise and about storytelling itself. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Our fourth speaker this evening is Suzi Ronson, an author, songwriter, and former hairdresser and stylist. Suzi's here tonight to tell us about the extraordinary story behind her new book, Me and Mr. Jones, which tells of how she left school at 15, enrolled at a hair and beauty college, and went on to become David Bowie's stylist and helped create his iconic Ziggy Stardust hairstyle. We can't wait to hear more, and Suzi's joining us this evening from New York City. Suzi, welcome. Well, I think you're muted. You're on mute at the moment, Suzi.
Okay, here I am. Thank you. Thank you so much. What wonderful stories they were. I feel quite intimidated in the actual fact. People ask me a lot, why did I write this book now? And the simple answer is I didn't know I could write a book. It took me a long enough time, I must say. But the book is about my time with David in the 70s, and I'm going to tell it to you now, a little synopsis. I was born a few years after World War II and lived with my parents in a typical suburban house in a typical suburban town, Bromley in Kent. My parents got married after the war simply because that's what everybody was doing. The government encouraged families and were generous with allowances. My brother and I used to get free milk and cheap lunches at school. Both my parents worked. My father was a long-distance lorry driver who delivered meat all over England, and my mum was an assistant in the local chemist shop. I don't think my parents expected too much from me. I think they thought I would, leave school, have a bit of fun, get a job, and get married and live around the corner. Well, the swinging 60s changed all of that. It was a great time to be a teenager in London in the 60s. I mean, we seemed to have it all. Great music. I mean, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Pink Floyd, what fantastic music. Groundbreaking fashion and a brand new medical breakthrough. The pill. It changed a lot of things. I was not good at school. I didn't like school. I left school when I was 15. And my mum said, I had to get a trade. And it was either secretarial or hairdressing. Well, hairdressing won, and I was enrolled in the Evelyn Paget College of Hair and Beauty in Bromley to study hairdressing. Well, it turned out I was quite good at hairdressing, and after I passed my course, they transferred me down to Evelyn Paget's of Beckenham. It was here I met Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Jones was my 2:45 shampoo and set on a Thursday afternoon. Every once in a while, she'd have a trim and now and again a chocolate kiss rinse. As I was doing her hair, she would talk to me about her son, David. Well, I would smile and nod, as you do. She would tell me how artistic he was. He was in a band and he played piano and guitar. And it wasn't until she mentioned Space Oddity that my ears pricked up. I said, Space Oddity? I've heard that on the radio. She said, well, it was a hit, I said, are we talking about David Bowie? Yes, she said, I'm his mum. Well, I'd heard about David Bowie. There was a buzz about David in Beckenham. He used to do an arty thing down at the 3 Tons. Played folk music, I thought. I hadn't been. The first time I actually saw David, he was walking around down Beckenham High Street wearing a dress. He was with this girl who had on these skinny black pants and a furry jacket. And I met the girl. She came into the salon with Mrs. Jones. It was Angie, David's wife. Well, I liked her right away. She was so cool and confident, and she looked so good. She had this, as I say, this great jacket and pants on. You didn't find coats like that in Beckenham. As I did her hair, and when she spoke, she was American. I'd never met an American person before. As I was doing her hair, she told me a bit about her life. She would go to gigs with David, and she would operate a follow spot if there was one, and help the band with their costumes and the changing. And she seemed incredible to me. The whole thing sounded so glamorous. She left with a big tip and a smile and promised to come back. Well, I didn't see her for a few months. It was Christmas before she came back. Well, every self-respecting hairdresser knows that you're fully booked at Christmas, so I didn't have time to do her hair. I saw her leave the salon and followed her outside and said, Angie, I can come to your house and do your hair if you like. She accepted, and off I went to Haddon Hall. Haddon Hall was about a mile out of town. It was one of those Victorian mansions that had been divided into flats. David and Angie had the ground floor. It wasn't the sheer size of it that was overwhelming. It was the way it was decorated. A midnight blue carpet, midnight blue walls, and a silver ceiling. There wasn't much furniture, a couch against a wall, some musical equipment, some cushions on the floor, a long, low coffee table covered with album covers and magazines, and David sitting in the bay window flipping through a magazine. He and Angie were discussing the merits of cutting his hair short. He had kind of long, blonde, wavy hair at the time. Angie asked me my opinion. Well, I said, nobody's got short hair, and it was true, nobody did. It might look quite good. And David gets up and he comes over and he shows me this photograph of this young girl in a magazine with this short red spiky hair and says, can you do that? As I'm saying yes, I'm thinking to myself, that's a girl's hairstyle, and how am I going to actually do it? Inside, though, I was excited. I mean, David was the perfect person to carry off a hairstyle like this. He was tall, rock star thin, long neck, great face. I mean, if I could pull it off, it might look really good. Well, it took me about a half an hour to cut. I was cautiously optimistic. But it didn't work. By the time I finished, it wouldn't stand up. It just kind of flopped. I didn't know what to say. I mean, David doesn't look too happy and I don't feel too bright. But I said, David, the second we dye your hair, the texture will change and it will stand up. I was praying I was right. I found the colour quite quickly the next day at my work. I snipped someone's hair off and did the colour on it. Red Hot Red by Schwarzkopf from their fantasy range. I used 30 volume peroxide to give it some lift. Now to make it stand up. We didn't have gels like you have today. I think the most thing we had was like soft setting lotions or dippity-doo, and that wasn't going to do it. I remembered using an anti-dandruff treatment. I said on the old girls at the salon, it was Guard from Germany. Side effect, it set hair like stone. So I used that. Any doubts David had disappeared the second he saw himself in the mirror with that bright red hair sticking straight up on his head. He looked incredible. And a huge wave of relief washed over me. I'd done it. I'd done it. It was standing up. He's running around. He wants to go to the sombrero with Angie. And I start packing my things to leave. Angie says, how much do we owe you? I think I said, £2, please. They left and I left, and it wasn't for a while when Angie called me. Angie called me a month or so later and she said, the band are playing in London. Would you like to come up and see the band play? Yes. I got a couple of girlfriends. I still wasn't sure what to expect. We played folk music, remember? He'd had the hit Space Oddity, but it hadn't been for a couple of years. You know, I thought he might be a one-hit wonder. We drove up in my car, and when I got to the college, I mean, the first thing, this place was jumping. It was sold out. There was kids everywhere. These kids were about my age, but they weren't like me. They were like well-educated kids. We went into the venue and sat on the floor, and some lights went down and some music came on, some classical music, and David and the band took to the stage. It was a real, oh my God moment for me. David was in full makeup, wearing a costume, like a bright red costume with long red plastic red boots. All the band were in costumes. I found out later they'd been made from curtain materials from Liberties of London. They looked incredible, and when they played, I mean, they just blew the roof off this place. They were so good. I went home thinking to myself, well, that wasn't folk music. It was incredible. Angie called about a week or so later and said, did I like the gig? Yeah, I loved the gig. Would I like to come back over? There was someone she wanted me to meet. I went back to Haddon Hall, and standing in the hallway was a tall, slim young man with blonde hair and blue eyes, dressed beautifully. And he kind of twirled and lisped and minced a bit. And I was entranced by this man. It was Freddie Beretti. He helped design the costumes for David. Well, I was entranced by him. I'd never met a gay man before, so it was really unbelievable. Later that evening, we were in the living room, and I watched as David leant over and gave Freddie a big kiss, like a proper kiss, right on the mouth. I didn't know which way to look. I mean, I was so shocked. I looked at Angie, and Angie went, oh, boys will be boys. And I suddenly felt completely out of my depth. I didn't know the boys kissed. I didn't know any of the people they were talking about. I had never heard of Nietzsche or Iggy Pop or Lou Reed. I was only 2 miles from home, but I might have well have been a million miles away. Before I left, though, Angie took me to one side and said, David and I have been talking, and we'd like you to leave your job and come on the road with us. Go see our manager tomorrow, sort out your wages, and come on the road. Well, I was both excited and, kind of be honest with you, terrified. These people weren't like anybody I'd ever met before. I was a bit scared. But I did go see the manager, Tony de Vries. And by the end of the afternoon, I got the job. I'm driving home, still terrified, but also very excited. Thinking to myself, my life is going to really change. I'm going on the road with a rock and roll band. I could scarcely believe it. I told my mum, and then I went down to Evelyn Paget's and gave my notice in. My boss looked at me and said, you know, Suzanne, you should think twice before giving up a well-paying, secure job. I said, yes, I have. After that, my confidence knew no bounds. I took Woody, the drummer, and turned him into a blonde Ziggy. I chopped off Trevor Boulder's hair, he was the bass player, and dyed it blue-black. The only holdout was Mick Ronson. He didn't want me to touch his hair, and I'm not really sure why. David was the most ambitious person I'd ever met. He was all about how to step forward, how to make things work, and he wanted to do rock and roll theatre. So his manager hired the Rainbow Theatre in Finsbury Park, and we were all set up there to put on this amazing show. And it was an amazing show. We had scaffolding, dancers, Lindsay Kemp came, mime artists, scaffolding, I mean, dried ice. We worked there like 8 hours a day. We were sworn to secrecy. Don't talk to the press. Don't tell anybody anything. It's a big secret. Well, of course, the more you make of these things, the more they become. By the time the show came around, we'd sold out. The audience went wild. They loved it. I think the only person that didn't like it was Elton John. He walked out halfway through saying, this isn't rock and roll. And it might not have been rock and roll, but whatever it was great. So we started touring England, and you could just feel the momentum gathering with this thing. Every night we sold out. Every night there were fans chasing us across, chasing the bus, mobbing the band. It was really incredible. I didn't know quite how to deal with all. I think none of us had ever done this before. So it was really quite a unique experience. I wanted to go to America with them, and I wasn't sure I was going to be invited, but at the last minute I was. We went to America and we started in New York and stayed at the Plaza Hotel in New York. What an amazing hotel. It's a bit like the Dorchester in London. We never had any cash on these tours though. There was never any actual money. We could stay in the finest hotels and order room service, but there was never any actually cash in the hand. I had a bit for, costumes and whatnot. We went down very well in America, so we started going across country. And David wasn't flying. He wouldn't fly. He had to drive everywhere. So we left him in Kansas, and the band and I flew into LA and went up to the Beverly Hills Hotel. Beautiful pink confection of a hotel situated in dark green vegetation. It was here I met Iggy Pop. He was at the pool. And I'm lying down ordering myself a lunchtime cocktail. It was a beautiful place, great pool. And I felt a shadow come over me, and it was Iggy. I looked up and I was surprised. I was even more surprised when he sat down. I didn't think he knew who I was. He started talking to me about his hair. He wanted to make a change. And I looked at him, and really, I quite liked his hair. He had this long, messed up do. It was a great haircut. I couldn't think of anything I could do to make it better. Then he mentioned color. Well, I had some blue that I used to use on Trevor. Later that evening, with bleach, color, scissors and cape in hand, I went to Iggy's room. I bleached out big clumps of his hair white and added this blue, so it was a really good color. And Iggy said to me, I said to him at the end, don't go in the pool. And that color needs time to set. Well, he didn't pay me any mind. By the end of the afternoon, he'd been in the pool, and there was a streak of blue from one end to the other. I went to Japan with them, met Kansai Yamamoto, picked up some fabulous Japanese costumes. And suddenly I was important. The girl with the thick frizzy hair had disappeared. I was somebody else entirely. After that tour, I went back to Beckenham. I walked around Beckenham High Street, looked at all the shop windows, and Beckenham hadn't changed. I'd changed so much. I'm so grateful for David. He took a big chance on me, took me on the road with him. I want to thank him for that. My haircut's on British currency now, the Brixton £10 note. Who would have thought I could have done that? Thank you so much.
Oh, Suzi, that was amazing. These stories are incredible. We've thought about nostalgia tonight, and all I can think about is what it was like to move through that world. I have so many questions. Thank you for sharing your stories with us. And remember, you can buy a copy of Suzi's book, Me and Mr. Jones, to find out more. Thanks.
You're welcome.
You've all been fantastic, and we've learned so much from you and thought about so many different topics. Remember that you can order copies of all of their books from Newham Bookshop, our independent book selling partner, and details about those are being posted in the chat again right now. Thank you so much all for tuning in at home, and do keep your eyes peeled for more events coming up, including our next 5x15 in May, featuring Clover Stroud and Johan Hari. Thanks everyone, and good night.